Good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along to talk to you this evening. My talk tonight will be about birds of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. It will hopefully give you a lot more information about a lot of the species that inhabit the Dales and how important the area is for many of these upland bird species. And along with that, we'll try and talk about some of the work that the National Park Authority do and some of the management that goes on to try and conserve some of these iconic species. Just a bit of information before we start about national parks. They are a really important landscape designation. There are 15 members in the national park family. You can see from this map, from the Cairngorms right up in the north of Scotland, right through England, Wales, and down to Dartmoor, New Forest and the South Downs, right in the south of the country. So they were designated under the National Parks Act in 1949. And these are protected areas that the government decided needed protection because of the beautiful countryside, wildlife and cultural heritage. So I'm sure you'll all agree, and one of the reasons you're here tonight and the members of the society is that, you know, the Yorkshire Dales is an extremely beautiful place, lots of countryside, and as I'll hopefully tell you tonight, quite a lot of important wildlife. I think one of the key things when we do these talks is to try and impress upon people, many in the audience tonight will already be aware of this, but these are working landscapes. The Yorkshire Dales, I think the National Park Authority owns something like 0.5% of the area. It's basically a few car parks and a couple of areas of woodland. But other than that, it is a working landscape. So all the land is owned by farmers, shooting estates, that make a living out of this land, and it is their livelihood and business. So bear in mind when we're talking about some of the wildlife conservation work that goes on in the Dales, we have no direct control over land or any of the policies. So a lot of the work we do is advisory. So it's working with key stakeholders, other conservation organisations to try and deliver the wildlife conservation work that we want to see in the Dales. But because we don't own the land, we have no direct control over it. So I think it's a key point to remember when we're looking at some of the issues that the uplands face. Another key thing about national parks is that we have to welcome visitors. We want people to come and enjoy the landscape, the wildlife, and to have a really great experience of the outdoors. I think this is becoming more and more important, and there's a lot of, as I'm sure you're aware, in terms of the sort of mental health, mental well-being, how being out and about in the open areas can be so good for a whole range of, you know, mental and physical health. And I'm sure, you know, we all felt through lockdown being stuck in and not being able to get out, you know, realize just how much we miss being out in some of these open spaces. So again, one of the many roles of the National Park Authority is to try and make sure that people from a whole different range of areas can come and enjoy the special qualities of the National Park. So that's just a very sort of brief sort of introduction to the work of national parks. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is the boundary of the National Park. We did have a boundary extension that, again, some of you may know about in 2016. So we now cover, you can see the figures here, 71% of Yorkshire, 28% in Cumbria, and 1% in Lancashire. So there was the areas you can see here, the sort of lighter orange areas with the extension areas. So we did have a significant increase in our area that was protected and designated as a national park. But unfortunately, we didn't get a corresponding budget increase to cover that. So we've been trying to do a lot of the work with very similar budgets to we had before. But again, I'm not quite sure where everybody's from tonight, but that should give you a sort of a good area, an understanding of the area of the national park. So all the work that we do has to conform to these statutory purposes laid down by government. There will be a test on these at the end, so please make sure that you read them all thoroughly before we go. But really, just to reiterate what I've said in the earlier slide, really, that all work of the National Park authorities, everything we do has to conform to these national park purposes that are laid down by government. So obviously conserving and enhancing the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage, but also, like I say, this promoting the opportunities for people to come and enjoy the special qualities of the national park. So every decision, everything we do has to take into account these purposes. As well as that, we realise that you know, one of the key things that drives a healthy national park and, you know, the whole landscape, wildlife and everything else, and that is the social well-being in the local communities. So it's really important that we've got thriving local communities at the heart of the Dales, heart of the national park, that can deliver a lot of these conservation actions. So again, one of the things that, or any decision that's made, any of our policies have to take into account all the economic and social well-being of these local communities that we fully appreciate. We're fully aware they're key to driving the fortunes of the national park across the area. So I just thought I'd give you a brief introduction into the land management section, which I work in, just to give you a feel for some of the work that we do. We have 3 teams within it. We have the farm conservation team, that look at advising and working with landowners primarily on agri-environment schemes. I'm sure some of you are aware of these. These are the grant-aided government schemes that enable farmers to be compensated for carrying out positive land management, especially if they incur a loss to do that from their standard farm business. So very simplistically, you can see in this slide, there's a number of hay meadows, which are really important for the farmer. They cut the hay or the silage, they'll store it over winter to feed the stock, and it's a crucial part of the farm business. So from a nature conservation point of view, to manage these hay meadows, and we've got lots of nationally important upland and lowland hay meadows as well. Ideally, the management for those from a conservation point of view is you wouldn't put a lot of manure or farmyard muck or fertilizer on them. You'd let all the grasses and flowers grow, probably take a cut mid-July into August when all the flowers have set seed and all the birds that are nesting in the fields have all fledged their young. And that would be the ideal from a conservation management point of view. But from a farmer's point of view, like I say, they need it for their hay crop and their fodder. So they may want to cut it a lot earlier before the birds have fledged and before the plants have set seed. So there's a potential issue there. So if they come into these agri-environment schemes, they can get paid compensation that will actually enable them to cut later and make money available so they can go out and buy additional fodder for their stock from elsewhere. So that it's a very sort of simplistic example, but I'm sure you can appreciate there's an awful lot of paperwork and bureaucracy in these. So our farm team will help landowners, advise them, work with them to get a lot of these habitats, you know, from the moorlands, you know, the pastures, the meadows, into these schemes, so that we can actually deliver the positive conservation benefits for a wide range of habitats and species. Very similar, we've got the trees and woodlands team. There's a lot of grants now in the last few years. The amount of funding available for woodland planting has increased dramatically from a whole range of different sources. So there's a lot of work again to get these schemes in and to make sure that the farmers and landowners can actually, you know, we can help them with the application processes, help with the funding bids, and help them devise management plans for the planting and delivery of these woodlands. We also have the wildlife conservation team, which I'm based in. Our role is sort of mainly looking at working with us to look at where the priority habitats and species are. So we can do a lot of advisory work. So for example, in you know, the case I mentioned earlier with the hay meadows, we've got most or nearly all of the, you know, the priority hay meadows all mapped now. We know where they are, so that when a farmer comes into an agri-environment scheme, we know exactly which fields are the key ones, in this case hay meadows, and that enables them, you know, to work with them and get the right management prescriptions and the right grants available for them. You know, things like the birds that I'll talk about tonight, you know, the key thing is carrying out survey work, finding where a lot of the rare and threatened species are. So again, we can protect them from potentially inappropriate tree planting, or the positive side of it, if a landowner comes into these schemes, we can target the prescriptions. So for example, for breeding waders, there are a lot of prescriptions about re-wetting ground, putting scrapes in, managing rush, late cutting of hay meadows. All these things can be implemented in an area that we know that is really good for breeding waders. So a lot of our work is about gathering this information and then doing constraints checks and sharing it with our colleagues in other sections to try and deliver the key national park purposes and protect these habitats and species. There's a whole host of other things we do. You know, a lot of advisory work, promotion, you know, things like doing talks like this are also a very key part of the job. So just to give you a bit of a feel about some of the priority species that we have in the park and that we deal with, I'm sure many of you will recognise this as lady slipper orchid, a really rare orchid that was reduced to a single plant in the country that was found in the national park that had to be wardened and guarded 24 hours a day by staff from Natural England to prevent collectors taking it. But thankfully, due to a lot of work from organisations like Kew and Natural England, a lot of seeds have been collected, plants propagated, and now a lot of these are being planted out into areas of the national park, some in very public places so that people can actually go out and see them and enjoy them. If that's one of the most sort of spectacular species, one of the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, really, but no less important. This is Yorkshire feather moss, a moss that's found in only one watercourse in the entire country, in the southwest of the park. So it's a really key species. It's an aquatic moss that grows just below the surface, so very few people can actually see it. But it is a really important species. Like I say, not as perhaps as dramatic as the lady slipper, but nonetheless just as important. We've got some key butterfly species as well. This is northern brown argus. This is one that frequents the calcareous grassland. The species it's like limestone grassland that requires a variety of flowers and food plants to nectar on, and also the larvae will feed on rock rose. So it requires these areas of limestone grassland that are sort of fairly lightly grazed. If they're too heavily grazed, you lose a lot of the flowers and the crucial plants. So if you look at the sort of distribution, you know, the Yorkshire Dales is one of the key areas for this particular species. And thanks to the work we've been doing with butterfly conservation and the monitoring work, we think this species is stable across large areas. The dormice, this is one of that's a species that was reintroduced into the national park a number of years ago up at Aysgarth. Historically, it was found right across Yorkshire. Quite widespread in many areas, especially in the lowland areas, but declined quite through sort of Victorian times and became extinct in the county not long after. So a species that was reintroduced, and we'll be doing a lot of management work in freeholders. There's some of you may be aware of the Wensleydale Dormouse project that we ran a number of years ago, looking at trying to increase woodland areas around that area, connect hedgerows, plant new areas of hazel woodland to try and get the population to increase. So that's a project that's ongoing at the moment and doing quite well. Another one of the mammal species we focus on is the red squirrel. We're still very fortunate that we have this species in the northwest of the park, mainly in Cumbria, but also we've got quite a good population in the Hawes and Upper Wharfdale area. Sort of based around Langstrophdale, the greenfield plantation there. So it's declining in many areas, a lot of issues primarily due to, or mostly due to the non-native grey squirrel that's forcing it out and also causing the spread of the squirrel pox virus. But we last year we looked at the data for the national park, examined all the records and monitoring work, and we were really pleased that we could show that the population of this species was actually stable in the Dales, which is a really good thing given the declines in many areas. So that's a very brief run through, hopefully give you a feel and flavour for some of the other priority species that we're involved in. And some of the priority habitats, we have large areas of blanket bog. These are so important for a whole range of things, for the habitats, for the species that they support, for carbon storage, and everything else like that. I gather you're speaking next month is about the blanket bog from the Yorkshire Peak Project, so I'm sure you'll learn a lot more about that from that presentation. But it's a key habitat that we have in the national park, and one that there's an awful lot of work being done by a wide range of stakeholders. As I said a slide earlier, some of the hay meadows and grassland sites are such a key feature from both from a landscape point of view and also from a nature conservation point of view. With nationally important upland and lowland hay meadows that also have a whole range of plant species and support a good number of breeding birds that I'll go on to talk about later on tonight. And also limestone pavement, that's a unique habitat. We have about 50% of the UK's resource now of limestone pavement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, in the Malham area, the clints and grikes on this, but it's a very important geological feature, and also it supports a whole range of important plant species as well. So we have a lot of more woodlands, different types of pastures, meadows, but these are some of the key, just to give you a feel again of some of the key priority habitats we have within the national park. And all of these will support a whole range of different bird species that I'll go on to talk about tonight. So that's just hopefully giving a very brief introduction of sort of the work of the authority and the sort of habitats and species we're involved in. So we'll now go on to the main part of the talk to look at the bird species. So we'll start off on the high ground, the high tops. These are predominantly areas of heather, as you can see in this. Very few trees, very little scrub, but a lot of heather, which is all managed primarily for one particular species, which is the red grouse. So when you see all the work that's done, the areas that are cut, the areas that are burned, in the past there has been quite significant drainage of some of these areas, because the red grouse do prefer drier areas than wet. But some of that is being rectified now. So all the management work that you see on these moorlands is to provide a huge number of these birds that can be shot during the shooting season. So basically, to get a good grouse bag, you need to get high numbers of chicks off. So this is a lot higher than any sort of natural mortality that you'd get in a natural population. So these birds breed at a lot higher density than they would do naturally, and all the predators are controlled. The legal predator control that goes on is to protect any mammals or birds taking the chicks. So when it comes to August the 12th, you have the biggest number of young birds that are harvestable from a shooting perspective. So it's one of the reasons why a lot of the areas of heather moorland are still heather moorland. It's highly likely that without grouse shooting, that these would have been lost, they would have been drained and turned into sheep pasture. But it does present a huge problem for a number of our bird species. The hen harrier is probably the most well known of all these. I'm sure you've all seen the various news articles and information about this. Persecution does remain a problem. It's something that is very contentious. It's very difficult to prove. It's very difficult to actually get anybody in court due to the fact that these birds nest in very remote areas, well away from people. It's very difficult to actually catch somebody in the act of doing anything wrong against these species. But I think the key thing, and I say this to a lot of audiences, general audiences, when I do this talk to them, that there's enough suitable habitat in the north of England for round about, depending on the density figures, you look at 320, 360 breeding female hen harriers. Last year there were 31. So there is a huge difference between the number of birds that are actually nesting in the uplands and the number that could be supported. There is a lot of work going on. A lot of stakeholders are doing a lot of positive work, trying to work with the shooting organisations, and we are seeing a slow increase. 2020 we had 6 pairs nesting in the national park, which was the highest number we've had since at least before the Second World War. So there are some positives, but there is still a long way to go on trying to tackle this particular issue. But what we're hoping for is more birds like this that have got, as you can see on the left there, quite a good number of young. Another species that's been badly affected is the peregrine falcon. This is a species that is widespread in many areas, but unfortunately it's still absent from many grouse moor sites across northern England. So I did a piece of research looking at the data for the Dales back in 2004, and it showed there was a strong statistical difference between the productivity of peregrines on grouse moors and away from grouse moor sites. So the only thing that can really be explain that is a management type. You know, if it was bad weather or food supply, these things would impact the birds across the whole of the national park. You wouldn't get one specific land use type that would be having such a negative effect. So it is a species that has been affected. If you look at the last national survey that was done several years ago, they found that the population had increased slightly nationally. They're now spreading back into many areas, many towns, villages of in the sort of uplands, especially. The big cities have all got peregrines, but they were declining in many upland areas where they were used to have their stronghold. So like I say, there really are some issues to do with the birds of prey, and it's perhaps one of the most contentious areas of work that we deal with from a nature conservation point of view. It's not all negative. We have run the Moorland Peregrine project. Hopefully some of you will have been to see the peregrines there, or at least aware of the project. Unfortunately, we've had to postpone it again this year because of COVID. But it is a fantastic project that we've managed to engage with since 2003. We're probably just short of 400,000 people have actually stopped, looked at, and seen how fantastic these birds are. It's a really great project. I'm fully admit to being completely biased on this, but it is a really great project. When you're there, you can engage with, you know, whether it's small children right up to, you know, grandparents sort of thing. You can ask them, you know, we have the telescope set up there, you know, focusing on the birds. You can ask people, oh, you know, do you want to see a peregrine? And they sort of say, yeah, and they sort of wander over, they'll look through the scope. You say to them, can you see the bird there? You know, for example, there's a tree. If you go down to the bottom left of the tree, you can see the bird. And they go, yeah. So you know quite clearly they've not seen it. So then if you get the tree in the telescope, have a look down bottom left, the bird's there, and it's like, yeah. So you still know they've not seen it. And then you say, go at the bottom of the tree and, oh, wow, there it is, fantastic. It's, you know, it's such a positive vibe that you get from these people. That, like I say, right from age groups, you've got kids, you know, ushering the parents over, the grandparents to have a look at it, the birds, and vice versa. So it's a great project that showed just how important and how much people enjoy seeing birds of prey. We also did a number of years ago, looked at the sort of economic benefits and found that, you know, a lot of people were coming back to see the peregrines again. We're fully aware that Malham's very important and many people go there anyway, but a lot of people were coming back year after year just to see the peregrines. So we could show that these birds of prey do have a positive economic benefit for local businesses in many areas. So if we had more birds of prey, hopefully they would have a positive economic benefit to the communities. The moorlands are also very good for a number of breeding wading species. So this is the golden plover. As you can see from this photograph, hopefully in the foreground, you can see the burnt stems of heather. So this bird does very well in areas that are managed for grouse. So it benefits from the heather burning that creates open patches of moorland, and also from the predator control that goes on along with. So there's very few ground predators, stoats or foxes or anything else like that can take the young. So many of the moorlands are designated as special protection areas in the Yorkshire Dales as part of the North Pennines Special Protection Area Complex, with one of the species being golden plover, which is a species that you can see here. Another key upland species, the raven, a species that, similar to some of the birds of prey, was persecuted quite heavily, but thankfully is now spreading back and it can now be found in many areas. So it's a key species. I think for me, You know, if you can hear the ravens calling, this classic cronk cronk call that they do. I don't do impressions. I charge a lot more for doing the impressions for talks like this, but the cronking call of the raven when you're out and about on the fells, to me, really does, you know, highlight that you are out in these upland areas. And it is a bird that is characteristic of these areas. So like I say, thankfully it's spreading back into many areas. There are still problems. It's, you know, it's not liked by a small number of farmers and from, you know, some gamekeepers, but it is a species that is coming back into the national park. The uplands will also have a few surprises for us, as well as the resident birds. This is a snow bunting, a species that breeds in Fenno, Scandinavia, and there's a small population breed up on Cairngorm up in Scotland. And these birds will come to winter in this country, and every now and again we get a small number coming into the Dales in winter. Very unpredictable. You could walk on fell tops and miles and days on end and not see one. Or as I found on this one, it was just at the roadside up on Fleet Moss, for anyone who knows the road that goes over from Wharfdale over into Wensleydale. That's quite a semi-regular place for them at the roadside there. So they're always a good sight to see. They do occur in varying numbers each year. Many years we might not get any at all. Some years there's big influxes. I used to, before I was a wildlife conservation officer, I did work in the ranger team. So we did all the footpath works on the 3 peaks, repairing all the footpaths, putting all the stone flags in on those. And there was what year was it? 1998. We were really late doing the work on Ingleborough. We were airlifting flags in, and it was a horrendous summer, so everything was delayed. So all the work was put back. A lot of the tidying up work, we were, you know, trying to reinstate some of the grass areas around the paths, reseed them, things like that. Went on well late into the year. So I was particularly keen to go up there because of the chance of getting species like the snow bunting. And that year there was half a dozen or so birds up there in late October. So let's just say that not all the seed got put on the edge of the footpaths as it should have done. A few found its way into discreet little piles away from the path that the snow buntings found and were attracted to. And when we finished the work in early December that year, there was at least 150 snow buntings up on Ingleborough. So it does show that some of these birds will come in good numbers, and there's always a surprise or two when you're out and about on the fells. Similarly with the dotterel, this is again very similar breeding to the snow bunting, so you can get dotterel on any of the fell tops anytime now. I think there was a couple seen in the North York Moors today. So these birds will be moving through from the wintering grounds in Africa to, there's a few pairs breed in Scotland. We have had in the 80s, we strongly suspect that a couple of pairs of dotterel may have bred, but unfortunately they weren't confirmed. But it is a species really of the fell tops. You know, think of somewhere like Cairngorm or perhaps some of the high Lake District fells. That's where you will get some pairs nesting. So this is more likely a bird to be seen on passage. Again, on the fell tops, you know, Pennygent, anywhere like that, Whernside could be key sites where you see these. There were actually a species that a lot of the fly fishermen went to hunt in Victorian times. There's records of people staying up at Tan Hill, up in Arkengarthdale, specifically to try and shoot these birds, because the red feathers on the breast were a favourite for the fly fishermen and were apparently really good at attracting fish. But thankfully, you know, none of those practices go on now. So that gives you a feel, hopefully, for some of the birds on the high ground, the Heather Moorland. So as we move down the fell onto the Moorland Fringe areas, I think this is a very underrated and area of land, and important for a whole range of different species. A lot of the Heather Moorland will be protected under the various legislation, sites of special scientific interest, triple SIs. These form a complex of special protection areas, the SPAs. So they've got a lot of legal protection and are very, very heavily designated. You have the hay meadows in the bottom of the valley that have similar levels of designation, you know, triple SI protection. But a lot of this ground in the middle that's sandwiched between has no legal protection at all. And this is the areas where some of the our most important species will nest. And we're still fortunate that in areas like the Yorkshire Dales, we do have large areas of this moorland fringe habitat. So one of the species you'll see on these upland areas, thankfully in increasing numbers, is the buzzard, a species that until relatively recently was a really scarce sight in the Dales. I know we were doing some field work in 1996 and came across a pair nesting in a wood up in Kingsdale. And as far as we were aware, they were the first birds to be sort of breeding back in the North Yorkshire area of the park for, pre sort of Second World War. So it was a real great thrill to find this bird back nesting, and thankfully, due to the protection and the easing of persecution, you can now come across this bird almost anywhere in the Dales. There's still issues in one or two places, but thankfully it is now a species that's widespread and regular, and you can come across anywhere when you're out and about walking in the national park. Grouse, a species that is found again, is one of the real classic sort of moorland fringe species. Unlike its cousin, the red grouse, this bird requires a whole range of different habitats. So it's primarily a sort of woodland edge bird. So it likes these wood and scrubby areas, gills that have got shrubs in, but it also will go on the heather at certain times of year. They will use hay meadows, especially in winter, where they feed on the seeds that have been shed from the plants, and requires a whole range of mix of these species in a relatively small area. So this is a species that doesn't pair up like many birds. It doesn't form a pair and build a nest. You have these display sites. So this is a lecking male black grouse, where they do this fantastic display where you can sort of see here on the right hand side this lyre-shaped tail that they spread out, and the white undertail that can be seen from a long way away as it does this sort of stuttering dance. Again, they just sort of do this sort of like dove-like call that can be heard from several kilometers away. So it really is a fantastic sight to see in the Dales. We've still got good population, thankfully. Mainly the peak activity at the Lek is the first 2 hours after dawn. So when we're doing black grouse surveys, it requires a number of early starts to get up to some of these sites and actually count the birds. To get up there at first light, watch the sunrise here and see such a spectacular species of this is a real privilege, and it's a fantastic sight. And we're lucky that we've still got many of these birds, especially in the north of the park, in a relatively good numbers. So that is probably one of the most sort of characteristic species you'll find on the Moorland Fringe. Another classic one is the ring ouzel, the upland version of the blackbird. Very, very similar. You can see it's got this white bib on the front, and also some sort of white edges to the featherings on the wings that you can see in this photograph. But it virtually is the upland equivalent of the blackbird. So it eats earthworms throughout a lot of invertebrates in the soil, and feeds in a very similar way to the blackbirds that you'll see in your gardens. Again, in autumn, it will feed on the berries and as it fattens up for migration, because it is a migratory species, breeding in this country and across Scandinavia, and wintering in the Atlas Mountains. Species has been a lot of concern about declines, but the last national survey did show that this species was stable and hopefully doing well in many areas of the national park. A species that some of you will perhaps be more familiar with hearing them than actually seeing. This is a skylark, a species that is found in really good numbers. If you get the white ground, the pastures on these moorland fringes, really do hold really good numbers of skylarks. There's been large-scale declines in this country, mainly in arable areas, where intensive cropping has led to the loss of grassland nesting sites for them. But we're thankful we've still got lots of these birds in areas across the Dales. And if anyone who was lucky enough to be out and about today on some of the moorland edges will have hopefully heard good numbers of these, because they're in full song now. across large areas. Like I say, you'll often hear the song, but it can be quite tricky to get a view of the bird quite like this. The wheatear is one of the ones that the bird watchers have been looking out for a while. They're sort of one of the first summer migrants to come back. Species that you can see from this does very well in the limestone areas where it nests. It can nest in scree, under boulders. You know, quite a few of them actually nest in old rabbit burrows. But a species that you will see and is really like one of the first signs of spring, really, for the upland bird watcher when they actually come across one of these species. So we should have quite good numbers back already, although numbers, I don't know if anybody else has been out and about, they do seem a bit lower. I think they're quite late back this year, some of the summer migrants. It looks like they may have had some poor weather on throughout Central Europe and on migration, so they are a bit delayed. But a few more days like this with some good clear weather and numbers should be back. These will be back on territory now and will soon settle down to breed, where hopefully you can see them across many areas of the Dales. A couple now with slightly contrasting fortunes. This is the windchat, a species that used to be found on the moorland edge. As you can see from this shot, likes areas of bracken. These are these eat insects, and used to be 20-25 years ago, you could more or less go to any sort of moorland edge that had some rough grass, like I say, bits of bracken, a few shrubs, and these species, you know, you would find them almost anywhere. But the population has crashed quite dramatically, and it is now a very scarce species and quite difficult to find, unfortunately, in the Dales. It's one where it's suffered probably a lot from problems on migration routes. It's a trans-Saharan migrant, so I'm sure many of you will be aware the Sahara Desert is getting bigger and bigger each year. So for small birds like this, they have limited fat reserves, and they're finding things like these, you know, as the deserts increase, harder and harder to cross. It's compounded by the fact that many of the migration stopover places, there's been agricultural improvements, and these birds are probably not in as good condition as they could be as they cross the deserts. And again, agricultural improvements in wintering areas can have an impact on the habitat. Means that, again, when they start some of their migrations back, they're probably not in as good condition as they perhaps might be. Which is probably what's leading to the decline. There is quite a lot of research going into the windchat just to find out what is driving it, but there's still a lot of work to be done to work out exactly what it is. So it's a species that you used to find, like I say, across many areas of moorland edge, but now seems to have been replaced by this, the stonechat, a very similar species. Again, it's insectivorous. If you look at the records from the Dales, it's a species that used to occur quite rarely in winter. Used to get one or two, but in the days when we had what might be called a normal winter, with heavy snowfall, you know, long periods of wintry weather and frosts, it's a species that died out. Any birds at winter would just die, unfortunately, and not survive. But in the sort of, if you look at the records from the sort of 80s onwards, when you started getting these milder winters, what we think happening is the birds was, you know, the odd one or two birds were coming into winter, but because there was relatively little snowfall and the temperatures were quite warm, these birds were actually surviving the winter, and you know, a few pairs started to breed. And then, you know, numbers through the sort of like 1990s increased dramatically, and before those, was it 2012, 13 when we had the bad winters, and prior to that, these species were widespread, and you could go to virtually any edge of a moorland or a walk along a moorland edge and see stonechat, but unfortunately no windchat. So it is a species that is actually spreading into the Dales and is now breeding. I've seen quite a few pairs already this spring, so I think the relatively mild winter has meant that they've actually survived quite well. So two species, very similar habitats, very similar food sources, but with very contrasting fortunes. We've got the curlew, and many of you will be aware of the work that's being done now and the concerns about the curlew population. It's in dramatic decline across Europe, across the breeding areas, right across the area. There are nationally important numbers. I think the UK holds about 30% or over 30% of the breeding population in Europe. And areas like the Yorkshire Dales National Park are key areas for species like this. So there's a lot of work going on. A lot of the work we do through the agri-environment schemes that I talked about at the start of my talk, about getting landowners into the appropriate land management prescriptions, is to try and help and provide the suitable habitat for the curlew to breed. So it's an area, it's a bird that likes areas along the moorland edge, especially where there's brush. So it likes some areas of rush, so there's a cover for the adults to nest in and also for the chicks, but also quite large areas of open wet ground where it can feed. So it is, I think it was mentioned earlier, it is National Curlew Day tomorrow. So there'll be a lot of information on social media and no doubt the press about some of the work that's been going on to protect this right across the country. So there is a lot of work, like I say, going on in the national park, working with landowners, land managers to try and protect this species. The last survey work that we've done for species like this, we're working with the British Trust for Ornithology, looking at using their breeding bird survey data, which is a national survey that's done in randomly selected areas across the country. We've been lifting the records out for the national park, and although the sample sizes are quite small, we actually believe the population of this species is probably stable in the area, which is fantastic. Given the declines there are in many areas. It's not something to be complacent about. Like I say, it's still under threat. One of the issues is that these birds can live quite a long time, 20 plus years, but they're just not getting chicks off in many years. They're very site faithful, so they will return to the same areas to nest year after year. And if that area is, for example, a silage meadow, they will hatch the eggs, and then the eggs or the chicks will get cut by the silage. You get these early cuts. So there's a lot of threats to this species, and like I say, a lot of work that's being done to try and maintain and increase the populations. Another wading species that, again, nationally important numbers are found in the Dales. This is the snipe, a species that you're probably more used to seeing if you're out for a walk in winter over wet ground and just flushing away at your feet as it flies off. But when they are nesting, the males, which it almost certainly is, will be looking out over their territories and will make use of the fence posts and the dry stone walls that are in the Dales. So you'll probably get opportunities to see them a lot better than you would do normally. One of the things that first sort of draws your attention in the spring is their display flight, which is this drumming display flight that they do, where they fly high over the pastures, the meadows, the moors, and make this sound a bit like a kazoo, or if you put a bit of grass between your thumbs and blow it, that sort of noise. It's really distinctive. Many people think it's actually a call, but it's not. The snipe actually has outer tail feathers that are quite twisted, and what it does, if you ever get a chance to see one when they're drumming, is if you get your binoculars, get a close look, you can actually see it sticks out its two outer tail feathers. So when it does that and flies across the area, these vibrate and make this characteristic drumming noise. So again, any of you who've experienced it, it is a fantastic sound to hear, and luckily we still have them right across many areas of the national park. So we then move down into some of the lower dale areas, the Hay Meadow bottoms. As you can see, are some of the important areas for the farmer. We do have sort of scattered areas of woodland, as you can see from this photograph on the fell sides, and also river corridor woodland that are home to a number of key species. Waders are an important theme, so we in a lot of these lower areas we'll get the lapwing, species that, again, many are on eggs now, doing some field work in this warm weather. They've gone down quite early this year, so hopefully with the good weather we're having at the moment will be beneficial to this species. Slightly more difficult species to manage than some of the other wading species, wading bird species. They do require very short grassland to nest in, and tend to prefer areas that are quite relatively heavily grazed. And then when the chicks hatch, they'll take them away to some of the areas where there's more cover, in the areas where you might find the sort of the curlew and snipe nesting as well. So again, it highlights really you need a mosaic of habitats on the moorland edge, from some quite short open areas for species like lapwing to nest, and areas of denser cover with some thicker vegetation for species like the curlew and snipe to nest. Another one, a wading bird, we've still got relatively numbers, although I'm quite concerned there seem to be declining, unfortunately, the redshank. We know from many other areas, upland areas of the country, this is a bird that is in decline. And it's a bird that requires a lot more open water. So you can sort of see from this photograph, these areas where you might get a small pool along the moorland edge or on the valley bottoms, you know, an oxbow lake, those type of things. They do require that open water habitat for them to nest. So we've still got many areas where you can still fortunate enough to see the redshank, but I think it is a species that we should be concerned about and keeping a lookout for. Hopefully this is a species that will be coming back in the next week or so from its African wintering ground. This is the wood warbler, a species that used to be found in a lot of areas of mature ancient woodland or semi-ancient woodland. Places like Stridwood, for anyone who's been down there on the Bolton Abbey estate, that used to be a key area for this species. I was looking at a Yorkshire Bird Report not so long ago for 1984, when there were 25 singing males recorded in Stridwood. I think last year there was 1, possibly 2 birds recorded. So it is a species that's in quite serious decline. It seems to, areas like Grasswood used to have sort of 4 or 5 pairs. I think I only heard 1 bird there sort of briefly last year. So it is species like the windchat that is a trans-Saharan migrant that is struggling. We suspect it's probably again due to migration or wintering areas, because a lot of the woodland areas, you know, if you think somewhere like Stridwood, the habitat has probably remained unchanged for a number of years. So there is probably something to do with migration or wintering routes. But a species you can still find in some areas of the park, although in a lot more numbers than we used to have. I'll include how sparrows in my talk. Some people seem quite surprised by this, but it's one of these species that I think we get quite complacent about. One of the issues we have is to, you know, with some of the farmers, trying to explain to them how important curlew are, and they'll tell you that they'll see them every day when they're out and about on the farm, and they're that used to it. So I think we do get used to, and are perhaps complacent as we do get used to seeing some of these species. What it sort of brought home to me was a number of years ago when we launched the Malham Peregrine project. We did a press launch, and there were various people up from RSPB, because it's a joint project with the RSPB that we run there at the Cove. So we've been up at the Cove looking at the peregrines and done various press work. And we're walking back down to Malham, to the National Park Centre down there in the car park. And I was talking to Peter Holden, who at the time was the sort of lead national RSPB organizer for these sort of Art Bird's brilliant projects. And I was doing my sort of corporate bit, telling him about all the waders, the black grouse, you know, how important the Yorkshire Dales was for them. And he just stopped in the middle of Malham and said, "You've got house sparrows." And I said, yeah, house sparrows. Yeah, anyway, back to these black grouse, curlew, all these really important, you know, species. And he said, no, he says, you know, you've got these house sparrows here. And we got talking about it. And he was saying that he lived down near RSPB headquarters down in Bedfordshire, in a sort of very similar village size and everything to Malham, and they'd completely lost their house sparrows. So, you know, it's a species that we're so lucky that we've got. You know, all the villages are in and around the Dales are still got good numbers of these species. So, you know, as they're declining in many urban areas, you know, it may well be that areas like the national park become important for species like this. And also, it's close cousin of tree sparrow, very similar. You can see the difference. The male house sparrow on the left has a very grey crown on the top of the head, whereas the tree sparrow on the right has this brown head and a white collar. The species that tree sparrows we were a lot concerned about used to be fairly widespread, but are in quite sharp decline. But my colleague was recently ran a tree sparrow project looking at encouraging people to put nest boxes up for them, looking at feeding them in winter, get some hedgerows planted, and it is a species that seems to be moving back into the area and back into the Dales. So we've got promising signs that that is a species that is returning. Another species that, you know, I'm sure many of you out and about bird watching in the Dales will see a lot more of, and that's the barn owl, a species that used to be incredibly scarce when I was a young teenage bird watcher in the area. Trying to see a barn owl, they were virtually unheard of. There was rumours of one pair in the Dales, and I ended up having to go down to Norfolk to see my first barn owl. But now they're thankfully spread into many areas. They're now widespread, you know, right up to the high ground. Some of the high altitude sites, places like Moorland Fringe have got barn owls, which they never had historically. So it is a species that's managed to move back into the area, and thankfully is doing really well. So hopefully, if there's lots of barn owl chicks like this, that we ring some of them under license. Just on the bird on the left, you can see a metal ring on its leg. This is something that's put on, doesn't harm the birds at all. We're all specially trained and fully licensed to do it. But it helps us monitor the spread of these birds and where they go and how far they move and how the population is doing. So we are starting on a barn owl project in the Swindon quarry area to try and get some barn owl boxes, and working with local landowners and parish councils to hopefully get the spread of those birds back into the area. The dipper, many of you will be familiar with this from the rivers and streams in the national park. Species that is a lot of bird watchers will come to the Dales specifically to see these, you know, upland streams, stony stream bottoms, ideal habitat for them. The clear, clean water. The fact that we have got so many dippers and they're so widespread is a testament to the water quality, because they feed on aquatic invertebrates, a lot of caddisfly larvae, things like that, that are only found in the areas where you get good water quality and that are not polluted. So the fact that we've got dippers across such a large area means that you know, a lot of our streams are in good condition and you know, healthy populations of fish and invertebrates in them. One of the concerns for this species, there's a guy who over in the Sedberry area of the national park who's been doing a long-term study on these for decades, who approached us a number of years ago because the species was in decline, and they found that there's real problems with nests getting washed out. So it's very susceptible because it makes its nest over water or next to water. These flash floods that we've been having in many springs where you get torrential rain, the water rises very quickly and rapidly, and washing nests out is looking like it's having an impact on breeding success. So there is concerns, you know, climate change. One of the predictions is that these sort of extreme weather events will become more frequent and more regular. So if we do get into cycles of heavy flash flooding in spring, even though the water quality and the habitat's all right, dipper is one of the species that may actually be a problem, and there may actually be a lot of concerns about it. So again, it's a species to keep an eye on if we do get these sort of, like I say, changes down to climate change that can impact on a whole range of different species such as this. And I'll leave you with my final slide of the evening. This is the yellow wagtail, a species that I've done quite a lot of survey work in over the years. Again, this is a trans-Saharan migrant that will be coming. The first ones will be back any time now. I like to finish on this slide because I think it really highlights the importance of organisations and the work done by the National Park Authority, and also the important role that landowners play in this. A lot of the time, there's a lot from many people sort of criticise landowners and the land management practices, but I think this is a species that really shows that if there are organisations like the National Park Authority that have time to invest and work with the landowners, we can make a huge difference. So this is a species that when I started in 1999, we looked at my sort of work program and what species we needed to look at. And the yellow wagtail was one that came up as being a species that was found, used to be widespread. If you read any of the sort of bird books of the Dales in the sort of 50s and 60s that were written, the species that was found in every hay meadow. But we knew that it was a lot more rarer than that, a lot more restricted. So we did some survey work in a small number of Dales just to sort of try and get a feel for the population. And we found that it had been lost from many areas, and there were just small clusters, for example, around Moorland, where this bird was still surviving. So what we realised in looking at other research that had been done, that early cutting was one of the big reasons. The change from hay to silage and the earlier cutting dates was one of the main drivers of decline on this. So we worked with Natural England, and again, it's sort of an example of the work I explained at the very start, where we went out, the authority went out and did a survey work. We worked out the meadows where the yellow wagtails were nesting. And then we worked with Natural England and the landowners to get the meadows where we knew that were nests into an agri-environment scheme with a late cutting date. So that would enable the birds to nest, lay their eggs, hatch the young, and the young could fledge. So in the 3 or 4 years we were doing that, we've had very good results, and we found that the areas where we were monitoring the population doubled, in some cases trebled, in those 3 or 4 year periods. But I think it's one, again, I like to finish on because it shows the importance of landowners in this. So when we had chance to actually speak to the landowners, they'd probably seen these birds for years, never really knew what they were. We explained what they were, why they were important, where they were nesting. And they really wanted to do as much as they possibly could to actually, protect these species. So when we were working with them, there was 1 year when it was a really late spring, and these birds were very late back, and it actually pushed the nesting period over the agri-environment scheme nest cutting date. So several of the farmers rang me up, said that they wanted to start cutting the meadows, but they were concerned that the yellow wagtails were actually still in there nesting. So I went to one farm up on Moorland Moor, where I just pulled into the farmyard. The farmer's wife came charging out of the house. It looked like a big stick, opened my car door and said, "I've got some canes here. We'll go out into the field and mark out where the nests are so they can drive around them when they were cutting." So we went out, and thankfully those birds had actually fledged, so we didn't need to do that. But it just goes to show that the lengths, again, when the farmers are aware of these species, they will go to try and protect them. And one of the other farmers up in Littondale, he had the same issue when I went out to see him, and they were still feeding young in one of his meadows, and he said, "All right, I'll just change my cutting regime." And I hadn't realised till after the event that basically this meant that the field they were nesting in was the first field they normally cut, which was next to the road. And they'd normally work through the meadows and work back to his farm, but he got contractors to start at the far end and drive right round and keep driving round and round. So we left this meadow with the birds nesting, and he only cut it when they'd actually fledged. So he will have incurred quite a lot of extra cost to make sure that these birds actually fledged and hatched the young and were successful nesting. So it's a species, like I said, I like to finish on because it shows that if organisations like the National Park Authority have the resources, have the time to go out and do the survey work out where these birds are, the vast majority of landowners are really keen to work with us and realise how important these birds are and want to protect them as much as we do. So it's a great species to finish on. We're on a real positive note, and hopefully highlight how important the landowners are in all this. So there's quite a lot of species to go through. There's lots of other species I could have talked about, but hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of the species we get in the national park, how important they are, how important the national park area is for these particular species, and how through the work of the authority and the goodwill of many of the landowners, we can actually protect them. And I hopefully have shown in this how we can stabilise and hopefully start to increase some of these species. So thank you for listening.